I am Brian Morgenstern here with the great Sam Lyman. Much to discuss this week. Bitcoin hitting the mainstream in the official National Republican Party platform as President Biden deals with more fallout from the debate and trying to keep his base lined up behind him. Let's talk about all of it. Where should we start, Sam?
Let's start with the GOP and their embrace of Bitcoin. They are now wide awake to the benefits of Bitcoin as well as its geostrategic importance. So let's go back to Trump's tweet from a few weeks ago. Brian, I know that when Trump tweeted this, you were in close coordination with the campaign, helping advise them on Bitcoin and its importance. And there's two things from this tweet that I wanted to focus on. First, when Trump says that he wants all remaining Bitcoin to be made in the USA, all caps. And also when he points out that any sort of policy that hampers Bitcoin development in the US only helps China and Russia. From these 2 points alone, we can see that Trump himself now recognizes that Bitcoin is a digital asset or commodity of geopolitical significance, which is huge because, in the last Trump administration, Bitcoin was an afterthought for a lot of people. And in the current Biden administration, people don't even want to think about Bitcoin. If anything, they want to eliminate it. But now you have a leading presidential candidate of the United States actively embracing this idea that Bitcoin is an asset of geopolitical significance. So, like I said, Brian, you have been closely advising the campaign since the start when it comes to Bitcoin. How did you help them recognize Bitcoin's nature as something that can actually really affect things in foreign policy? And how would you explain that to our listeners?
Well, I don't want to take credit. There are a lot of very smart people who have been talking to the president about these issues and informing him that there is a really passionate block of voters in the United States who cares about Bitcoin, and that it would make good policy and good politics to embrace it. But on those points that you raised, look, Bitcoin is a global asset. It is a decentralized network that is secured by computers that are all over the world, hundreds of thousands of computers everywhere. And there are only 21 million Bitcoin. That is, its scarcity is one of its most valuable characteristics. And so the remaining Bitcoin are either going to be mined here in the US, and the future transaction fees will be earned by US companies, or they're going to be earned by somebody else. And so it's critically important that if the US is going to maintain leadership in finance and in technology, that we recognize it needs to be mined in the US. And so that's why the made in the USA quote is so critical, so important, and so catchy. It's true. So, we know that Russia and China, we think there's mining in Kazakhstan and some other countries. We think some of our other adversaries are trying to capture some of this value because of the decentralized nature and because of the scarcity. If we really want the U.S. to maintain leadership, it's critically important that this industry flourishes here in America with law-abiding citizens and companies capturing this value. So, because there's a supply cap to some extent, unlike other assets, it's sort of a zero-sum game in terms of mining the newly minted Bitcoin. And so that's why it's so important, and to build up that mining infrastructure so that the transaction fees in the future, so that those transactions are being facilitated by miners in the U.S. So making sure that we're capturing the value, not Russia and China or other adversaries of our country, very critically important. There was another line in there about Bitcoin mining helping the USA to be energy dominant. This also plays very closely into President Trump's broader agenda. So he has, in the 16 campaign and in this campaign, he's talking about tax cuts, deregulation, better trade deals, and energy independence. It was energy independence, now it's energy dominance. He recognizes the benefits of Bitcoin mining when it comes to energy infrastructure because, as I mentioned, the network is decentralized. That means it is flexible. So where a lot of miners operate in Texas, for example. It can get very hot or very cold. Those energy grids need flexibility to kind of toggle up and down with various functions so that when it's 100 degrees in Texas, everybody has plenty of power for their air conditioning in their homes. Or if it gets very cold, they have a winter storm, and they need home heating. You can have flexible demand loads like Bitcoin mining that will help facilitate new energy generation because they will buy the power when it's cheap and abundant to mine Bitcoin. But then when the grid needs more resources, they can use miners as a flexible load to toggle up and down so that there are no disruptions on the grid. As this country needs more power for AI, for Bitcoin mining, for the economy of the future. Bitcoin is actually a critical piece of that to help bring more power online and make sure it's available when people need it most. So, the fact that President Trump understands that well, the fact that he was willing to say it publicly is a major, major development for this industry, for these voters, and in this election. So, very happy that the campaign understands these things, that the president's advisors understand these things, and that the President Trump himself is very clued into these things. So, really major developments. Things, gradually, then suddenly is the kind of a tagline in the Bitcoin industry. Things seem to be happening very suddenly in a positive way right now. And that tweet was monumental. I think it set Twitter on fire in terms of Bitcoiners seeing it and gasping like with joy and saying, "Oh my gosh, a major candidate understands us." So huge positive development for the industry. Very glad that President Trump really kind of took the bull by the horns and put that statement out there.
Absolutely. I think it's one of the biggest developments in Bitcoin, not just in the last year, but the last few years, the fact that we have Donald Trump now supporting Bitcoin. I also like to think of the United States today as Saudi Arabia in the early 1900s. So Saudi Arabia in the early 1900s was sitting on a treasure trove, one of the biggest oil deposits in the world. They were a backwater desert country until it was discovered just how much oil they had underneath them. I think in many ways the United States today is similar. We have the greatest Bitcoin potential of any country in the world in terms of how much abundant energy we have, how inexpensive it is, in terms of how much Bitcoin intellectual mind share we have, in terms of how much hash rate we have. The United States today is the Saudi Arabia of the 1900s. It's just a matter of us recognizing the treasure trove that we're sitting on in terms of Bitcoin development and what we can do with our Bitcoin potential, which raises this really interesting concept of Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset. So, one of Donald Trump's biggest hesitations in embracing Bitcoin was this idea that it would actually compete with or in some way obstruct the dollar or weaken the dollar. But there's new ideas out there that actually Bitcoin can be an asset to shoring up the dollar. So during the campaign, we saw that Vivek Ramaswamy and RFK Jr. both put forward proposals that considered backing the US dollar with a basket of commodities that could also include Bitcoin. And then there's this idea, again, of Bitcoin as a strategic reserve currency. So, Dylan, would you mind pulling up this article? I wrote on this subject in Forbes last week. That Trump tweet that you mentioned, Brian, it sparked so much discussion about what we can do with Bitcoin as a country, how we can use it as a chess piece in international relations. And that starts with making Bitcoin a strategic reserve asset. So, this is an idea that's really been gaining a lot of traction in DC policy circles. And it's something I reached out to Senator Lummis about. I asked her staff, what does Senator Lummis, the crypto queen of Congress, think of this idea of Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset? And she said, quote, Bitcoin is an incredible store of value, and I certainly see the benefits of our country diversifying its investments. So she herself seems partial to this idea of putting Bitcoin either as a treasury reserve asset or a strategic reserve asset. Brian, I'm curious what you think of this idea. Do you think that there's real potential for this in a Trump administration? And what do you see as the pros and cons?
Well, I do see the potential there. The U.S. government owns a lot of land. They have a lot of oil. They have a strategic oil reserve. It used to, we used to back our dollar with gold deposits. It's sort of a hard, scarce, finite commodity with recognized value around the world. I think the modern version of such a commodity is Bitcoin. It's scarce. It is transferable anywhere. It's actually better than those things because you don't need to transport it anywhere. Uh, you don't have to bring bars of gold on an airplane. You don't have to send tanker trucks full of oil anywhere. You can transfer it electronically, instantaneously anywhere in the world. So it does make sense. Um, Congress and the Fed have been, I think many would recognize, been playing a little fast and loose with our money supply. And so the dollar's value has diminished greatly in the last several years, 25% just in the last 4 years. So how can you sort of solidify the value of a dollar? Well, first, the government needs to get its spending under control. It needs to stop printing more dollars. Every new dollar it prints diminishes the value of existing dollars. Perhaps we may look into the relatively recent past, the last 50, 60 years, and think maybe we want to toggle back towards backing the dollar with commodities that people use in their everyday life. Bitcoin has a value that is uh, global, just like oil does, just like energy commodities do, just like wheat or beef or other things that people need in their daily lives. Perhaps if we were pegging the value of a dollar to things that have global value, it might have a more stable track record going forward, in terms of maintaining its value, maintaining its dominance. This is not some crackpot theory that you and I just came up with. This is something that's been talked about regularly by mainstream economists. Art Laffer, who created the famous Laffer curve about sort of finding the ideal tax policy and maintaining productivity in your economy. He has talked about a basket of commodities. Steve Moore, and among others, generally on the supply side of the economic spectrum. But this is a mainstream idea. It was not far fetched. In fact, the U.S. employed this idea. They backed the dollar with gold for a long, long time. So maybe diversifying that beyond just one commodity, but having, like I said, kind of this basket where maybe you have the fixed, the scarce supply of Bitcoin as part of that, as an asset that's transferable globally instantaneously. Maybe you have an energy commodity in there like oil, or maybe a basket of energy commodity. Maybe you have oil and uh, you know natural gas and nuclear or whatever. I mean, you can have a whole collection of different sources of energy, solar, wind, whatever you want, all of which has obvious value for driving our economy forward. Um, it's certainly worth a conversation. There's a lot of concern these days about the value of the dollar and maintaining dollar dominance. So, and you've written, of course, about sort of a tech stack of money, if you will. That's the way I conceptualize it. So maybe you can talk about that. But having the dollar backed by sound assets like Bitcoin and oil and maybe platinum, gold, uh, maybe wheat, having the dollar backed by these hard commodities that have value all over the world, and then have the dollar made more easily transferable with stable coins. Now, a lot of our Bitcoiners uh, may disagree with that. They may take issue with that because many believe that Bitcoin should just be the global reserve currency itself. But in terms of maintaining, uh, you know, the U.S. and democratic values and a more secure world, if we want the dollar to remain dominant, you could have this tech stack of commodities, Bitcoin, oil, wheat, whatever, backing pegged to the dollar. So it has a more stable value. And then the dollar more easily transferable in the form of stable coins that can be transferred instantaneously around the world. It's certainly a discussion worth having. I think very smart people may have different views on this, but I'm very glad to hear that a United States senator at least has had her interest piqued on this subject. So I don't know. Why don't you get into more about how you see it?
Yeah. And so what you were describing at the end, I like to call the Bitcoin stablecoin barbell strategy. This idea that Bitcoin and stablecoins can actually work in tandem, that Bitcoin, a lot of people think, oh, Bitcoin will replace the dollar. Maybe will actually save the dollar or has the potential to do that. And I think you touched on how that might work. If we make Bitcoin a strategic reserve asset or use it as part of a basket of commodities to back the US dollar itself, you can then use stable coins abroad to increase demand for US debt to help alleviate some of the debt woes that we have. And by so doing, you're actually effectively having Bitcoin and the US dollar working together. So as demand for Bitcoin increases, demand for stable coins and by extension, the US dollar will also increase. So you have this positive flywheel effect where demand for the dollar is driven by demand for Bitcoin and vice versa. And in this scenario, you actually have stable coins as a layer two solution for Bitcoin. Because if you have Bitcoin partially backing the US dollar and you have stablecoins acting as a proxy for the US dollar and Bitcoin, you're solving a lot of the scaling issues that currently exist in the Bitcoin network. So I call it Bitcoin nationalism or the Bitcoin stablecoin barbell strategy, whatever you want to call it. It's worth a discussion, like you said. I think that there is a real possibility here that Bitcoin and the US dollar can work in tandem with one another. Now, another way Bitcoin could be used as a strategic reserve asset has to do with gold. So the US is currently the largest holder of gold in the world. And we know that whichever country holds the most gold historically typically commands the global economy. So the United Kingdom, they held the most gold throughout the 1800s and early 1900s. And before them, the Spanish Empire held the most gold. So gold is a critical asset to hold on your balance sheet if you want to have a reserve asset that has lasting value that is resistant to inflation. So it's great that the US has a lot of gold right now. Coincidentally, we also have the most Bitcoin, but gold can also be used as a way to push back against the US dollar system ever since the US dollar moved off of the gold standard. And what does that mean? It means that today gold is the de facto BRICS currency. BRICS standing for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These are these other countries that are major economies outside of the US that have the potential to compete with the US dollar if they wanted to. And there's been a lot of discussion among BRICS countries of developing their own currency to get off the US dollar system. So, what you've seen is a lot of these countries, especially Russia and China, they've been hoovering up as much gold supply as they can. And coincidentally, Russia and China are also the world's largest producers of gold in the world. So, this is a really interesting way that Bitcoin could be used to sort of hedge against gold as an attack on the US dollar. If the US decided that this was a worthy cause, it could actually be the first developed nation to spark widespread Bitcoin adoption by making Bitcoin a strategic reserve asset. So, what would that do? It would effectively be a vampire attack on gold. So, for those who aren't familiar with the concept of a vampire attack, in crypto, we're talking altcoins now outside the tried and true world of Bitcoin. We're talking about the altcoin casino. What some of these altcoins do is they will launch a competing altcoin to try to suck liquidity and users away from an existing altcoin. So we saw this in 2020 with Uniswap. They had their own token, and then a competitor came about called SushiSwap. They launched a competing token to Uniswap that sucked away or drained away a lot of the liquidity and users from Uniswap and brought them over to the SushiSwap token. So that's how I envision Bitcoin. Bitcoin is, in a way, a vampire attack on gold. It has many of the same properties as gold, but it's arguably superior in all the ways that you mentioned. It's more portable, it's more verifiable, it's more scarce. And so it has the potential, if you saw a developed nation truly embrace it, like the United States, it has the potential to suck a lot of the users and liquidity away from gold itself. And there could be a lot of unintended consequences that come from that, which need to be discussed, right? But if the US were the first big country out there, the first home of global capital to come out and say, hey, we recognize that Bitcoin is an asset that's here to stay, it's an asset of real geostrategic importance. We're going to put it on our balance sheet. Then you see some crazy game theory playing out after that, where other countries, in order not to be left in the dust, they'll start adopting Bitcoin as well. And what you see there is this process of hyper Bitcoinization that could be really interesting if it plays out over the next decade. So those are just some ideas that I've been toying with recently. But Brian, curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a whole new world we'd be entering into, but it's important. I'll go back to the reason why this discussion is worth having to begin with, and that is uh, that our currency, at least the value of it in terms of its impact on people's lives, on their spending power, is not in great shape right now. There are a few things the government should do. One is dramatically cutting spending and reducing the prognosis in terms of our debt. We're spending more on debt than we are on some critical programs, defense, Social Security, just to name a couple. So cutting spending is the most critical way to abate inflation, which is negatively impacting people's lives. The other side of that is making our debt more secure, creating more demand for it, making it even more liquid than it already is. And this could be a critical way of doing that. It could really strengthen the country's economy and positioning in the world. Um, People act like the first part of that equation, government spending, is impossible to get under control. We certainly are in a bit of a spiral right now, and we need multiple solutions to get out of it. And so I think you have to look at both sides of the equation, and that's why I think this conversation is very important. Very high-minded and academic of us to talk about this on this podcast, but I'm glad we're doing it because somebody's got to do it. And I know we're not alone in our thinking. There are some very, very smart minds that are thinking about this. So if you are someone who agrees with us, or if you disagree with us, reach out, send us a note, tell us we're crazy or we're brilliant, whatever your opinion may be. Uh, Hit like and subscribe for this podcast, first of all, and then find us on social media on Twitter at MorganSternNJ and at Sam Lyman33. Let us know what you think. I think this is a very important thought exercise that could help strengthen our country going forward.
Yeah, and we're just in the beginning stages of this. I mean, we are among the first people in the Bitcoin community to really start talking about what could a national Bitcoin strategy look like. As I mentioned earlier, the Biden administration has nothing even remotely resembling a Bitcoin strategy. If anything, they have an anti-Bitcoin strategy where they're trying to eliminate it in different ways, or at least historically have tried to. But it's a conversation that we need to start having because other countries are having it at this point. Dylan, can you pull up the tweet about the German member of parliament who has talked about the need for Germany to have a national Bitcoin strategy? In this tweet, she mentions that the US itself is now debating this idea of Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset. And she's saying, hey, Germany needs to do the same. As it turns out, Germany is selling a crap ton of Bitcoin right now. It's what is suppressing the price. We're in about the mid 50,000s as of this morning. And we see that Germany is talking about a national Bitcoin strategy. So we need to be talking about the same thing. Brian, I know you've been advising the Trump team on Bitcoin. Let's say in the first 100 days of a Trump administration, you were tasked with writing a national Bitcoin strategy. What would that look like? What sort of policies would we need to push forward or executive orders in those first 100 days to really make the United States a place where all Bitcoin could be made in the USA?
Oh man, that is that's a loaded question. Okay, so first, Bitcoin principles, HODL, hold on for dear life. Uh, the U.S. has, I think it's 200,000 Bitcoin, most of which was seized in the past from illegal activities, Silk Road and the dark web, things like that. Um, so the U.S. is one of the world's leading hodlers of Bitcoin, but it's treated currently like any other seized asset from a criminal enterprise in that it gets auctioned off, and the money then goes either to the general treasury or it can go to a you know restitution victims fund or something along those lines. Um, Many in our community, I tend to agree, believe that that's not a good strategy. That member of the German parliament, I think, would agree with me that it would make more sense for governments to not to seize Bitcoin all the time. If it is misused, okay, that's one thing. But rather than just treating it like any other seized asset and auctioning it off, uh, to having a strategic reserve. So that would have the U.S. HODL its existing pile of Bitcoin, its stash, perhaps purchasing more Bitcoin, rather than having kind of the Fed print money and then buy its own debt back and have this sort of washing machine of its own money, um, starting to accumulate assets that will have value behind the US dollar. So, hodling is one piece of it. Fostering innovation and the growth of the industry here in the US is another piece of it. Just to give you sort of a compare and contrast or a before and after. For example, with the Bitcoin mining space, the Biden administration's policy has been to try to crack down on Bitcoin. They don't like it because individuals can hold their own assets, the government has less control. So they've taken this approach of having the bank regulators try to cut off bank accounts for digital asset companies, not just Bitcoin, but other digital asset companies as well. They've taken this tack of having the EPA and the Energy Department uh, take steps towards, quote, limiting or eliminating Bitcoin mining from the United States because they don't like that it uses a lot of electricity. Um, they have, of course, the SEC, the regulators there have made it difficult for really any digital asset company to function in public markets. So, sort of reversing that posture and seeing the strategic value of this industry for driving the future of finance and financial technology and setting clear rules of the road so that these companies can thrive in the US. That's another piece of the policy. And I would probably say off the top of my head, a third prong would involve a central bank digital currency. Now we have China uh, using it as a tool of surveillance, where they can kind of control how people spend their money. They can say you're only allowed to shop at this supermarket that is within a mile of your house. If you take that a couple of steps further, if they decide they don't want people to buy firearms or beef or gas or anything else, they determine you've had enough. You shouldn't buy any more. They can turn your money on and off. So really having, central bank digital currencies could be a privacy eliminator and a tool of government surveillance. So I think the US should be clear that we do not support central bank digital currencies. We want the private sector solutions to succeed, to have their space, regulatory sandboxes, or whatever term you want to use, to try new things and drive innovation forward. Um, it's particularly important because money historically has been of the private sector. Um, Even in the US, it was banknotes generally, where we had started to have kind of the modern day concept of money as storing and transferring value rather than pick your point in history, bartering economies or what have you. Um, Really, kind of our modern day conception of money started. It was born of the private sector, and it has always innovated and been more user friendly, more transferable. It has facilitated commerce more with innovation in the private sector. I think the U.S. should make that sort of a pillar of its policy thinking. But those are a few ideas that I would have that I think would help the U.S. really stand out and retake the mantle of leadership in this space. The Europeans and several Asian countries have really been working hard to craft clear regulatory frameworks so that these industries would move to their shores, so that they would take the mantle of leadership. I think we have to look at this from a competitive point of view, not just for the betterment of the US and Americans' way of life and their spending power, but in terms of geopolitical competition. Um, Unfortunately, the Biden administration's policy platform has been in I think we've seen sort of anti-competitive or driving innovation offshore. It's not just us saying that; it's virtually every fintech and digital asset company over the last 3 or 4 years has been saying the same thing. So the U.S. needs to adopt a posture of we're going to compete and win in this space because it is the next frontier of money, which is one of the most important subjects in the world in terms of quality of life. So I don't know. Those are my initial thoughts on it. I didn't know I was going to be crafting executive orders in this podcast, but here we are.
There you go. I mean, you did it on the fly too, and that was pretty impressive. What's most exciting about everything you just said is just how feasible it is. If we do have an election where Donald Trump is elected, he's made very clear from that tweet that reverberated around the world that he will be a pro Bitcoin president. So everything you just mentioned, whether it's the Bitcoin hodl strategy or making very clear that the United States will not create a CBDC, all of that is very feasible. And something you've mentioned in the past many times over, and I think it's a point that deserves to be repeated day in and day out, is that Bitcoin is anti CBDC technology. These two things go hand in hand. Bitcoin is a necessary bulwark against a central bank digital currency. It's money that promotes freedom. It's money that promotes the ability to spend how you wish without anyone intervening. Whereas a CBDC is just the opposite of that.
So the next logical piece of that conversation, though, is that skeptics, and I don't blame anybody for being skeptical. It's new territory we're covering here. But the next logical sort of train of thought is, well, but if the government can't control it at all, aren't you empowering bad guys or criminals and whatnot? And to that, I would say, if you don't like what certain people are doing with Bitcoin, you are really going to hate what they do with suitcases full of U.S. dollars, because U.S. dollars are still misused by bad actors around the world, and they're not traceable at all. If you want to be able to solve crimes and track down bad actors using clues, information, uh, things that are actually traceable, then you want a blockchain. You want a permanent ledger where you can use signals from that ledger, timestamps, wallets, IP addresses to an extent, although those are easily kind of gotten around with VPNs and stuff. But if that is your concern, then you still should be falling back really on Bitcoin. Another criticism is going to be, well, they use a lot of electricity. We need electricity for all these other things. We shouldn't be using it on something that not me, but whoever I'm arguing with in this scenario, we shouldn't be using it on something that I don't like. Well, because it's bad for the environment or whatever else. Two things on that. One, because Bitcoin miners are so flexible, they can monetize any energy. They can actually make natural gas projects more financially viable. They can also make solar or wind projects more financially viable if that's what you really want. And the majority of the energy used by the Bitcoin industry now, at least according to Daniel Batten, who follows these trends very closely, the majority of the energy used in the Bitcoin industry is now clean energy, renewable. So if that's your perspective, then you should actually like it. And then finally, a more philosophical point is, if you want to decide what people can and can't use electricity to do, that is, I put that in the same idea basket as a central bank digital currency. You really want to be able to control how people live their lives. That is antithetical to the values of a free society in a more open and democratic world. So, for all of these reasons, Bitcoin is critically important, and I hope and pray that the U.S. will see the light from the federal government standpoint. And I should add, we kind of talked about why the Biden administration's policies are not good and Trump's evolution on these things are good. We want to get to a point where every candidate is a pro Bitcoin candidate. Bitcoin doesn't care whether you're a Republican or Democrat. It is a technology. It is politics neutral. Now it has certain kind of libertarian values. I think that, an aura of that around it, freedom oriented values. But really, this is a technology. This is a community of people who are not that political. And like I said, Bitcoin doesn't care if you're Republican or Democrat. I think in the future, we'll get to a point where we're choosing between two pro Bitcoin candidates. Right now, in this election, at this snapshot in time, there's a pretty clear contrast. But some of the younger leaders in the Democratic Party see the values here. They see the value of financial inclusion, among other things. So hopefully, this is just a bump in the road on the way to a economy with sounder money that isn't inflated away the way it is currently. That is more small d democratic. Anybody can use it anywhere in the world at any time, and we'll get there. It'll take some time, but my hope is that we'll get there.
I'm hopeful as well. Brian, you mentioned some of the younger leaders in the Democratic Party and how they're embracing Bitcoin. Let's talk now about one of the oldest leaders in the Democratic Party who is not embracing Bitcoin. That is our president, Joe Biden. So, Joe Biden is experiencing a lot of pushback after his disastrous debate performance from a couple weeks ago. We are seeing multiple hit pieces in the media calling for Joe to drop out of the race. We're actually seeing some defections among senior Democratic leaders as well. If they're not explicitly saying that Joe should drop out, they are hinting or strongly suggesting that he should. And among the most interesting hit pieces I saw in the media this last week came from Olivia Nuzzi, who's a reporter at New York Magazine, where she talks about the conspiracy of silence to protect Joe Biden. So, this reporter has actually been covering the Biden family for several years. And as far back as 2020, she started to report or at least find evidence of cognitive decline in our sitting president. And in this piece, she goes through the conspiracy within the White House itself to protect the president from any critical media and to protect the president from journalists doing their job. What was most frightening, I think, in this article is that at one point, Olivia Nuzzi talks about approaching Biden, who again, she has known for years. And President Biden says, "Hello, what is your name?" Doesn't remember her, just completely blanks on it. So what's so frightening about articles like this is they seem to indicate that we haven't had a puppet president just for a couple months. It's actually been potentially a couple years, which raises a really interesting question. Who do you think is pulling the strings at this point?
Yeah, what a scary concept, right? It's unfortunately it's not that new a concept for the United States. Um, we've had several infirm presidents. The most common comparison lately has been Edith Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, towards the end of his presidency, had a stroke. And I think, with the benefit of hindsight and historical analysis, people have realized that really Mrs. Wilson was, in effect, running the country for some period of time, whom no one voted for. Right? That's a problem. I mean, it's come out, that President Kennedy had so many health problems with his back and such. He was on so many different medications that he had experienced, periods where he probably wasn't fully in control. Um, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had, polio. He was ill for many, many years. Who knows uh, how well he was doing? They had taken many steps to conceal the fact that he was in a wheelchair. They actually put that front panel on the Resolute desk in the Oval Office to conceal the fact that he was in a wheelchair. They didn't want people to think he was infirm. There are probably other scenarios that have been covered up. It's a demonstration that when you elect a president, um, I think what we have in mind as Americans is that we're electing that person to be the chief executive of our country. In the last few years during the Biden administration, it really seems as though it's been electing a lot of nameless people who are in the Biden orbit. But nobody voted for those people. So this is really distressing. And if you just think about it in terms of the policies we've discussed on this podcast, do you really think either of us could ask President Biden, what is Bitcoin? And think that we would get a coherent answer? I sincerely doubt it. And yet there is a lengthy executive order articulating a variety of policies that have very critical impacts on this industry. I doubt he really understands any of them. I hope I'm wrong, but that's just one example of this important issue. There are obviously many others. Um, and we've seen, throughout his presidency, what can happen when you have a commander in chief who is absent of his faculties. We had the sloppy withdrawal from Afghanistan. We have a wide open border. We have, as a result of that, a lot of crime, drug smuggling, human trafficking. We've had profligate spending that has been asked for and administered by a variety of Democratic Party apparatchiks that has just destroyed the spending power of the dollar. But we've had, all these things that people are very unhappy about with the current state of affairs. You wonder, would we have gotten to where we are today if we had a strong executive with all his faculties? Um, it's really sort of a frightening idea that you have an unelected, sort of nameless cadre of people in the orbit that are actually just kind of making decisions and handing stuff to him and having him sign it. Like, that's no way to run a country. It's not what the people voted for. It is anti small d democratic uh, of the highest degree. So really troubling what we've seen. Uh, with that article that you cited and others, I have to just, you have to ask the question, like, how long have they known, right? Carl Bernstein of Woodward and Bernstein went on CNN and said that he knows of 15 to 20 incidences of, senior moments over the last couple of years. um, why did he wait till now? Right? Like, because now it's socially acceptable to admit what we've seen before our very eyes for years. Um, you have to sort of indict the media on this, the Biden sympathetic media, that they're just now waking up because they can't hide it anymore. But this is really a profound problem in terms of the governance of the United States, the world's last remaining superpower. Um, Really, really shocking. And, even world leaders know it. The Wall Street Journal reported that a couple of years ago, the president skipped an event with the German chancellor to go to bed. We saw a video of Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, like, kind of leading him around because he didn't know where to go. We've seen him, reading prompts off the teleprompter, saying, when he's supposed to pause for applause, he reads the word pause. I mean, it's a lot of really troubling stuff. And it's heartbreaking for anybody who wants the US to be strong and to lead the world, to have just sort of a hapless president who's obviously not in charge. I don't know. I've gone on long enough. I'm sure I'm not telling our viewers anything they don't already know, but um, nobody voted for whoever's running the show, and we don't even really know who it is. It seems like maybe it's First Lady Jill Biden. She seems to be doing a lot of the leading around, and certainly nobody voted for her. So I don't really know what's happening, and that in itself is a big problem.
Oh, yeah. I don't really know what's happening either. But remember, folks, Trump is an existential threat to democracy. And the
Right.
only way to save our democracy is to vote for the nameless cabal currently running the country. I mean, that's the irony of it all, right? The
Yeah.
Democratic Party might be the biggest misnomer in politics right now. This isn't, like you said, small d democracy when
Yeah.
you have a figurehead who's purportedly running the government. In reality, we don't know who's running the show over at the White House. It's really quite disturbing stuff. But we'll see how it all shakes out over the next few weeks. Now, just to close out today, we have our grab bag section. And Brian, I know that you've done a lot of work with the Republican Party, different aides here and there to help them come around to Bitcoin. And we saw really good news this last week with the GOP platform. You talk more about that?
Yeah, please. Yeah, Dylan, we if you want to pull up that content, there's a tweet and a section of the there it is. A section of so this is the official platform of the Republican Party. The Republican National Convention is meeting next week in Milwaukee, where they will the formal nominations for president and vice president. Um, and the platform came out and it includes this passage. It says Republicans will end Democrats' unlawful and un American crypto crackdown and oppose the creation of a central bank digital currency. We will defend the right to mine Bitcoin and ensure every American has the right to self custody of their digital assets and transact uh, free from government surveillance and control. Critical points. The right to mine Bitcoin, as I said, the Biden administration has been really trying to end that. The right to custody your own assets. They've been trying to end that. They tried to regulate by press release to cut companies off from their bank accounts. They tried to regulate by court filing to declare that self-hosted wallets, if you self-custody your digital assets, that actually is a money transmitter business and you can go to jail for that. Um, Not by statute, nothing passed by Congress, not even a formal rulemaking. They just said it in a court briefing when they indicted somebody. Um, and they of course have an executive order out there to explore to take seriously the exploration of a central bank digital currency. So this is the polar opposite of the Biden administration's policies. This is I think the kind of philosophy that backs this is that individual empowerment, the individual liberty that the U.S. was founded on, that you see in the Declaration of Independence, that you see in the Bill of Rights, that is supposed to that government exists to protect people's God-given rights. They are not granted by the government, no matter what Heidi Prisbala from Politico or CNN may say, or MSNBC may say. Um, so this is really a profound and critically important statement. It shows that they've heard us. I've met with them and given them information, obviously, but many other very, very smart people have been conveying this information to them. And the fact that it was distilled into that very concise statement, but it's so profound, it's really, really important. And the fact that the word Bitcoin is showing up in an official party platform for the first time here in 2024 is a historic moment and a really important one. And I would say now the ball is in the Democrats' court. Like I said, my hope is that both political parties, all political candidates, will see the potential of Bitcoin and stop being scared of it. They'll learn about it. I've never met anybody who learns more about Bitcoin and likes it less. That is not a normal thing. Um, it really is a revolutionary technology that's going to make our quality of lives better. So, very pleased to see that showing up in the official Republican Party platform. That's a big development. I, a lot of people kind of think party platforms are just messaging documents. To an extent, they are, but they also provide a signal to if President Trump were to win re-election, how is he going to govern? That's a very strong signal that should show voters what to expect. So, you know, here we are just a few months before the election. That's in the official platform. Really important stuff. Very historic moment to see and really exciting. I don't know. Do you have a different take on it or do you
No,
tend to agree?
I mean, generally the same take. It's exciting too because we'll see in the next few days here at the Republican convention whether Bitcoin is mentioned a time or two in a couple different speeches.
Yeah, the next stop is the convention speeches. And if they talk about Bitcoin being made in the USA, protecting the right to mine it, protecting the right to self custody, opposing a central bank digital currency, this would be another really historic moment of this space going mainstream. That primetime viewers across America are going to hear about the value of Bitcoin. Usually, tens of millions of viewers tune in to the convention speech. It's a critical moment of the campaign. So, yeah, we'll be there eating our popcorn and waiting to see what happens. So, very exciting stuff.
Indeed. And that's about it for us today, unless there's anything else you want to touch on, Brian.
No, I'd renew my call. If you guys like what you heard, or you hate what you heard, or you have questions, send us a note. Hit us up at Morgenstern NJ on Twitter, at Sam Lyman 33. Hit like and subscribe, and we will see you next time on the Peer to Peer Policy Pod.